comments. We'll start with the Conservatives. Rachel Thomas. Rachel?
Sure, thank you. My first question here is for Dr. Geist. As you know, there has been a complaint that was filed with the Competition Bureau. And this complaint was put forward by News Media Canada, the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, and the CBC. And this complaint has to do with Bill C-18 and the fact that Meta has determined that they are no longer carrying news links. Now, they made this clear well before the legislation was passed that this would be the decision that they would make in response to the legislation. However, these outlets that I've just listed, or unions, are now complaining that, and I'll quote, by refusing to negotiate with Canadian news organizations in good faith for the access of Canadian news content on Meta's platforms, and by blocking the news content on the platforms, Meta is denying Canadian news organizations fair compensation for their content, leaving them with limited resources to compete effectively in the news publishing market. This last phrase here, leaving them without the adequate resources to compete in the news market, would say that Meta served as a vehicle or a platform by which these news sources were being shared. That vehicle is no longer provided, and these news outlets then are saying it's hurting them. But the whole premise of Bill C-18 was on the fact that the news outlets were actually providing the value, and Meta needed to pay them. In this, it seems that they're making an admission that actually the benefit was found in Meta being the vehicle. Do you care to comment on this further and expand on it?
Well, sure. I think that, as many pointed out, the reality is that there were great benefits that came to the publishers from social media and from search. Indeed, that was the basis upon which, in many respects, this took place for a very long period of time. And frankly, what we have seen in the aftermath of the legislation taking effect in June, I think, really confirms that we have seen, and I don't think it can be understated, real harm with news entities talking about lost traffic in the range of 30%. There are some news outlets that have stopped their services effectively or suspended their operations altogether. And I think particularly notably, there has been real harm from an investment perspective in this country. We've had a number of entities come forward to say that in the current environment, given the way the legislation has been structured, investing in news in Canada, given that legislation, just isn't something people are apt to do given that environment. So I think it's caused real harm based on this odd conception that somehow driving free traffic to publishers, which was clearly of value, we now see just how much it was worth, somehow required compensation, which at the end of the day was all about creating mandated payments for links, which is why I know myself and many others were deeply troubled by the foundational elements in the legislation.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. I want to follow up on something else that you said, and it's somewhat related. Now, we know that the big broadcasters, Rogers, Bell, CBC, have a lot to gain from Bill C-18, potentially. However, we also know that those that would be the new and up-and-coming platforms that are based online, which Ms. Hefner referred to as not actual news outlets, I would contend otherwise. I believe that they're legitimate. They've actually been hurt significantly by this legislation, and to your point that you raised in your opening remarks, many of them have made the determination to not hire more employees because they know that they might be put out of business potentially by this legislation. In your estimation, why would, it's not fair to ask why. I can't ask you to speculate, but I guess I'm just curious, maybe you could expand a little bit on Bill C-18 was put out by the minister at the time, Minister Rodriguez, as something that was meant to benefit the little guy. It was meant to benefit the local newspapers, the ethnic media, the local media source, et cetera, which many of these exist online. Why did it end up in a place where it is benefiting the big broadcasters?
Okay, I guess I'd respond in a couple of ways. First, it ends up benefiting primarily the large broadcasters. The Parliamentary Budget Officer tells us 75% of the money goes to the broadcasters, radio and television, largely based on the way it was structured. It went outside of the QCJO framework that we have around the labor journalism tax credit, which ensured that broadcasters, which are dominated by a handful of large players in Canada, would be the major major beneficiaries. Personally, I think it was a mistake. I think that, at a minimum, if the goal was to support the core, what we would think of as newspapers or digital publishers, then that's where the focus of the legislation ought to have been. But I think there is an answer to your why. And I have to say, I think one part of the answer to the why is that many of the online news organizations weren't heard. They were oftentimes not given opportunities, or when they were, whether at this committee or frankly at the Senate, at times they were disrespected. I can recall one of the largest of the independents that's operating in many Ontario communities, Village Media, appeared before the Senate. One of the questions that their CEO, Jeff Elgie, was asked by Senator Harder was, aren't you happy to see newspapers closing, because then you can scoop up some of the staff and enter into these new markets? The idea that online news entities somehow celebrate or welcome the prospect of the challenges that are being faced, I think such a total misread of where things are at. And so what we've seen in the recent months is everyone from Village Media to Narcity to a whole range of players basically screaming, this is causing enormous harm, and saying at a minimum, surely we need some sort of deal with Google, because otherwise the effects will be catastrophic, which one would hope will ultimately lead everybody to find some kind of compromise on this. But the harm here has been very, very real, and it was not just predictable, but it was predicted.
Thank you, Mr. Geist.